when you look at the Kathleen Peterson case, people usually split into two camps. Either Michael Peterson murdered his wife at the bottom of the stairs, or he didn't. But there is a third possibility, and on the face of it, it sounds quite ridiculous. The third theory is that an owl was responsible for Kathleen Peterson's death. An owl. And, you know, it sounds very ridiculous, but I think that's why it's lasted so long, because the more you look into it, the more it lines up with the actual facts. And yet it doesn't neatly explain everything, but in this case, nothing is neat, and everyone shifts the evidence to prove their own theories. And I think this theory actually lines up quite well.
Murder, cults, kidnapping.
Where the trail goes cold, we keep digging.
This is Dead Ends.
Kathleen Peterson was found dead in December 2001 at the bottom of a staircase in her home in Durham, North Carolina, and there was blood everywhere. Now, Michael Peterson, her husband, said he'd been outside at the time by the pool in the family home, and that Kathleen had gone in ahead of him, and that was when he came in and found her at the bottom of the stairs bleeding. The prosecution said that it was quite simple. She didn't fall. She was beaten to death. And their case was that Michael Peterson was the one who murdered his wife. The defense, however, said there's no murder weapon. There were no skull fractures matching the sort of beating the prosecution were putting forward. And there was no clear proof that Michael Peterson killed her. And so years later, out of all this speculation, out of all this looking through the evidence, we get this theory that maybe Kathleen Peterson's injuries began before she even got in the house. Maybe before she even reached the staircase, she had already been attacked. That maybe she was attacked by an owl. And it sounds, you know, the sort of thing that people just make up when they're desperate for an answer or some sort of grand speculative thing that sounds interesting, you know, a last-minute conspiracy theory. But the reason it kind of stuck is because it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from details that were actually already sitting within the case, with the evidence that was there, with the area they were in. And this all added up to make it look actually worth talking about. Because whether you believe it or not, we do have to ask the question, what happened to Kathleen in those last minutes? Was this an accident? Was this a horrific attack by her husband or someone else? Or could this have been an attack by an owl, by this animal? And so one of the weirdest things that people always bring up in the case is the injuries looked horrific to Kathleen, but not in the way that you'd expect from just a straightforward bludgeoning. Again, the sort of bludgeoning that the prosecution was saying Michael Peterson had done. She had these deep lacerations to her scalp, and there was a lot of blood everywhere. But they weren't the kind of skull fractures that you'd expect if someone had been repeatedly beaten over the head with a heavy object, like they were saying. And there was no obvious brain injury in the way that people imagine when you listen to the prosecution's version. And again, this is what the defense are trying to put forward, that actually the evidence doesn't add up to what they're saying happened. And so there's this disconnect between what the different sides of the trial are saying and actually what the evidence. You know, the scene looked absolutely savage, like really bad. But the injuries didn't line up with a simple beating. It didn't line up with that explanation of what happened. And that is where the owl theory comes in and actually starts to look more realistic the more you look at it. So basically, the theory says that Kathleen, on her way inside from being outside at the pool with her husband, near the door, near the exterior of a house, some point in that journey, she was attacked by an owl. And that would most likely be a barred owl which are common in the area, and they're known to be quite territorial, especially in sort of breeding times. And the theory is that this owl, the talons, caused the lacerations on the scalp. She's then run inside, staggered inside, confused, bleeding, probably in shock, and at some point has slipped down the stairs, fallen, and caused further injury. And then again, some people speculate that regardless of what the attack was caused by, she's then at some point potentially tried to stand up when she's regained consciousness, slipped back again, and caused further injuries. And people say that to try and explain where the blood was on the wall and where the blood ended up in the scene, the position of her body. So this theory says she was attacked by an owl outside, its talons caused the lacerations in her scalp, and then she's come in confused, hurt, in shock, and slipped down the stairs. And that in its basic form is the theory, the owl theory. And again, it sounds pretty wild. It sounds pretty unreasonable when you just say it in isolation. But the more you look at the evidence, actually, it does start to line up. So one of the most talked about details of this theory is there were microscopic feathers and bits of plant material that were found in Kathleen's hair and in her hand. These like tiny little feathers, and the sort of feathers they were are consistent with the barred owl. It's one of the only owls with these little tiny feathers running along its like feet, its talons. And so those traces existed. So if not from the owl attack, where would those things come from? You know, you can't just invent facts. They were proven to be there. And although it's a bit awkward, although it doesn't fully sound plausible, actually, when you look at it, you've got to follow what could have caused that. And actually, this does explain where those feathers could have come from. And then also, there's the actual lacerations themselves. So when you look at the wounds on Kathleen's scalp, they are more consistent with what a talon of an owl looks like, rather than a blunt force attack. You know, you can literally see them. It's like a little, like a trident, and it really does look like some sort of animal's claws have come into there, rather than someone has come with some sort of weapon and attacked her that way. And obviously, not everyone agrees with that. There are people who are experts on these things who don't agree with each other, and all of this is interpretation because there's no proof. There's no way to prove it. They didn't find a reasonable weapon. But this theory claims that these wounds do line up with an owl's talons. And to be fair, when you look at them, they do. You know, and when you look at the scene, even the amount of blood, you know, these scalp wounds would have probably bled pretty heavily. And so, again, that lines consistently with how she was found. If, as well, that caused her to fall down the stairs and cause further injury, again, this all is starting to add up to something that could be quite realistic, that could have happened. You know, it's this really narrow staircase that she fell down. The stairs are quite steep. When you're in that state of shock, I can see how easy it would have been looking at that to actually fall and cause further harm to yourself, you know. And it all does start to build this picture that maybe this is what happened. You know, the whole scene was quite horrific and it looked like a murder scene. But sometimes the amount of blood can just contribute to that theory, can contribute to confirming what people think they know and trying to prove what they want to be the truth, even if it's not the truth. And so, again, looking at the evidence, it starts to add up. There is one pretty big problem with the theory, and that's sort of the timings and sequence of the event. If she was attacked outside, people speculate and people ask, wouldn't there have been more blood outside? How did she get from that point to inside the house. Did anyone hear anything, Could she have screamed? And would she have been heard by Michael, who was still outside? How did she get from outside being attacked to inside at the bottom of the stairs without anyone noticing anything? And this, I think, is where the theory starts to look less solid for people, because it doesn't give you a perfect sequence of A led to B led to C. It's a little bit more messy. But again, like, if you've been attacked, if you're being attacked by an animal, instinctively, you're going to do something. You're going to run, you're going to try and fight back. Maybe she's already close to the house. Maybe, she just thinks she's been hit by a branch or something's fallen on her, and, it's dark. She can't necessarily tell what it is. So maybe she's just touched her head, seen the blood, panicked, and just really quickly moved inside. And maybe that is why there isn't any evidence outside to prove this theory. Maybe it is just being that it happened so fast and was so shocking that actually she's just quickly come inside to try and get away from that situation. Especially if she did recognize it as an animal, I would certainly be quite panicky about that and would want to get away. And so, it's plausible. It lines up with the evidence. And again, this is where the case sort of opens up, because if there's not beyond reasonable doubt for a jury to charge someone, how can you charge them with murder? How can we reasonably say Michael Peterson definitely committed the murder? And it is possible that he didn't do that. It's possible that this actually is the answer. And I guess looking at Michael Peterson himself, we're sort of judging this whole thing through his life. I think, again, that contributes to people trying to explain why he is the one who murdered. He is quite, secretive. He lies about certain aspects of his personal life, the sort of sexuality things which he's lied about to his wife, which, again, people speculate that this is the reason that he would be wanting to commit a murder. And again, in his past, there's another woman, Elizabeth Ratcliffe, had also been found dead at the bottom of a staircase in Germany. And it could be a coincidence, but some people claim that it is just too much of a coincidence to explain away the details and to say that he isn't guilty, and it does look quite damning that actually in one person's life, two people have been found dead in similar ways. But again, coming back to the evidence, it just doesn't prove that he did or didn't do it. The evidence just isn't there to show how he could have done it. And I think this is where this case gets so confusing, and it trips up that actually there are so many experts and they're all analysing, the patterns of blood, the positions of the body to show their thing works. And all you see these tests they're carrying out, and they all do look quite sketchy, I guess. You're seeing people carry out these tests to prove a solution they want. And so obviously you're conducting tests in a way that will prove that. And so it's quite reasonable that you would prove your theory if you set out with conditions to prove it. And the same thing could happen with the owl theory. You could look at the evidence and shape that in a way that proves it. And so where do you go from there? I think you're kind of left with speculation, left with personal opinion, because, you are fitting the evidence into a theory each point. And there seems like no way to actively prove one theory over another, especially when experts can't agree. Personally, however, I do look at this theory and think the more you look at it, the more plausible it does become. It asks for you to sort of think outside of the natural box, but not outside of a box of possibility. Animals do attack people, especially if they feel threatened or if they're trying to protect their young. And we do know that this kind of owl, the barred owl, would be present in this area, is known to attack people, even runners. The feathers on the talons, the talon shape on the scalp, it all adds up and it looks so much more plausible. And I think that is why this theory survives. You know, there's no weapon that is easily explainable as something a human, Michael Peterson, for example, could use to attack Kathleen. And again, this is why this theory has more and more weight to it, I think, because actually it does explain a lot of the different pieces of evidence. You know, it explains how she could have ended up where she was, in the state she was, the injuries that she had. And it doesn't prove it, but I do think it is worth looking at. And yes, it's not as a closed book a solution, because if this is true, I think people prefer to have some murder or some conspiracy. It's easier to live with a death like this if there is someone to convict, someone to blame, someone to say, yes, this person is responsible. If it's an owl, you don't have that same closure. And I think people would prefer that. But again, I personally, the more I look at it, I think this is probably the most likely reason she died. You know, I think this, looking at the evidence, explains it in a better way. So what do you think? Do you think that the owl theory has any weight to it? Or do you just think it's ridiculous? Do you think it's just speculation? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or if you have any more theories about who could have done it, even if it wasn't Michael Peterson. Or do you like him for it? What do you think? Do you like the owl theory or another theory? We'd love to hear from you. If you've got this far in the video, please hit the subscribe button. We would definitely enjoy that on this channel. We've got lots of videos about lots of different things coming up every few weeks. And until then, until the next video, thank you for watching. It's been Dead Ends, and we'll see you at the next Dead End. Goodbye.